You're talking about the reality that dawned on everyone once the convoy arrived as compared to what was known the day before.
Well, that's correct. Well, and what I would say is what was known the day before was that a large number, and the day before, so if this is the 28th, the 27th, is we were starting to receive numbers on what the size and scope would be.
Right.
And that the overall activity of the group moving across was extremely lawful and extremely law-abiding.
Right.
In your evidence in chief, you kept using the word violence regarding protesters, right?
Yes.
All right. And you've heard the evidence of Superintendent Morris already. You sort of touched on that. And he had stated that the lack of violence in Ottawa during the protest was actually shocking.
So I don't recall that statement.
All right. So is it fair to say that when you use the phrase violence, you're not actually describing any form of physical assaults, are you?
Well, physical assaults do contribute to what I'm describing. I was specifically describing the violence that our community felt as a result of the culmination of actions that the occupiers engaged in.
So the violence that they felt, not actual violence. Is that what you're saying?
That is correct. Not the criminal code definition of violence, but the violence that they felt by having incessant horns blared.
Right.
And by having trucks run 24/7 a day.
Right.
By having people intimidate them and follow them, and by having people rip masks off their head, by feeling sheltered in their homes.
Well, thank you. I understand what you mean. But you're not talking about violence under Section 2 of the CSIS Act, are you?
No, I'm not.
Thanks. This is an email from Commissioner Brenda Lucki to the Chief of Staff for the Minister of Public Safety, and she has a discussion about her views on the invocation of the Emergencies Act there. There she states, I'm of the view that we have not yet exhausted all available tools that are already available through existing legislation. There are instances where charges could be laid under existing authority for various criminal code offenses occurring right now in the context of the protest. The Ontario Provincial Emergencies Act, just enacted, will also help in providing additional deterrent tools to our existing toolbox. Then she goes on, these existing tools are considered in our existing plan and will be used in due course as necessary. You also, I take it, heard the evidence from Superintendent Morris regarding there being no credible threat under Section 2 of the CSIS Act, correct?
That's correct.
All right. And you agree with me that Superintendent Morris is the most senior intelligence officer in the provincial apparatus, is that right?
He's a seasoned and experienced and senior intelligence officer, yes.
Last question is, do you agree with what Commissioner Lucki said in the email I just read to you?
I believe it's a perspective for sure, and I think it's one that would be more appropriate to question her on. I've been very clear about how we utilize the provisions under the Emergency Act to actually execute our plan and create stability around the execution of our plan.
Right. Do you agree with her perspective?
I do believe there could have been other opportunities. There was provisions within all of those. What I have said, and I'll say again, is we leveraged the Emergency Act as it came out to create a very stable platform to be able to access tow trucks, to be able to do the 4 or 5 different areas that I identified. These abilities do exist, absolutely, in what Commissioner Lucki has identified. The Emergency Act created a very stable platform, a stable environment for us to execute our plan.
But last question, just because I just want to get this clear. But so you're saying that there was existing laws that you could have done the same thing under, is that right?
We had a plan. We were going to execute a plan.
Thank you.
I had grave concerns with the fact that there were children within the footprint of an area where the activity that was occurring, but beyond that, within the area where there could be enhanced or would be enhanced enforcement activity. So regardless of where it came from, I had and shared those concerns.
Were you aware that the Child Aid Society of Ontario had no idea that announcement was being made and were quite unhappy about it?
So I was the one who was liaising with the Children's Aid Society, and that was something in gaps we identified. That was a gap that we identified. I should have had conversations with them prior to that announcement being made. But as a result of the announcement, we were able to work together to identify the proper mechanisms that we would use in the event that we did identify children who needed who needed support within the red zone.
So you weren't aware that Navigator completed a report for February 5th that talked about some social media commentary about how they could be using, the protesters could be using children as human shields, and that based on that, they recommended that this announcement be made. You're not aware of that?
So I'm not aware of any report that was actually generated by Navigator. If you could take me to it, I could.
Okay. It's anticipated that our witnesses are going to say that the day after that announcement on February 9th is when workers from Child and Family Services started to intervene with the protest. Do you agree with that?
No, I wouldn't, because I don't believe that the Children's Aid Society of Ottawa ever directly engaged or intervened in the protest. What I do understand is that we set up mechanisms in order to be able to, in the event that there was an enforcement action and children needed to be removed and then reunited with family, we set up the processes that would be put in place for that.
But that was at the enforcement stage, as I understand it. You had set up, from my review of the records, an empty gymnasium of some kind to take children to, and then the plan was to give them back to their parents. That was what you're thinking of, is that right?
So I didn't develop that specific plan, so you'll need to ask the planning team what the specific plan was.
Okay. So you're going to hear evidence eventually from some of the protesters when they eventually testify that some of the ones that were arrested, upon their release, they were essentially kidnapped by OPS officers, driven out of town in the middle of February winter by OPS officers, and left in various rural areas and parking lots outside of town with no shelter or resources. Are you aware of that?
No, because I don't know the specifics of what they're speaking about. What I do know is that we, as part of our planning, and Inspector Lucas tomorrow will be able to provide more details, but we did have remote arrest processing sites, not in rural Ottawa, in the south end of Ottawa, in a residential mixed commercial area where they were protest and then released to be able to find transportation to wherever they needed to go, which is common with the police.
Right. So one of the areas, there was several, as I understand. One of them was a municipal parking lot where the trucks were being towed to.
That's correct. That's
Right.
in the south end.
Right. And that parking lot doesn't have a building you drop them off at. It doesn't have a phone. It doesn't have any of that, does it?
So I don't know what the logistics at the building were. I would imagine it would have needed to have a phone because you have to be able to call your lawyer. So
Well, I can tell you it didn't. So, and these people driven out there, they were already told they weren't charged. And they weren't being charged, they were being released. But they were driven and forced outside of Ottawa or in the outer skirts and dropped off in the snow. Now, are you aware this happened, yes or no?
No, I'm not aware, and it wasn't outside of Ottawa. It was still within the geographical boundaries of the city of Ottawa.